Right then, you bunch of screaming hairy armadillos, I'm finally back from Manchester, and I know I've left you alone for a little while, some might even say a little bit too long. That's why I come bearing gifts in the form of another little toots. So if you want to turn your shoddy looking drone footage into something that feels a little bit more GLAM, then what I need you to do is go make your favourite cup of coffee, infuse it with lion's mane, but don't drink it, just point at it and call it rude names. So if you're ready to get into this one, then you know what time it is.
Cocinemos un grado de color de fuego.
Right then, class, how we all feeling after our winter break? Sarah, did you have a good one? Wonderful. Luke, did you have a good one? Wonderful. Armando, are you still getting senoritas? Wonderful stuff. Now we got that out of the way. Today's mish is to show you how to turn your dusty drone footage into something that looks also bloody magnificent. And we're going to start off with the shot that's on your screen right now. And this is what I like to refer to as the basic teal and orange. And I'm going to show you 3 different levels of how to take this and transpire it into this. Saucy. But we're going to start off with this one. Key point, this isn't a very complex look, especially if you've got all of the elements working in your favour. When you start thinking of a desert location, pretty sure this was filmed in Nevada, Las Vegas, because that's where Emiliano Vargas is stationed, and as you'll see later in the shot, that's who was the focal point of this campaign. And when you start thinking of the desert, you start thinking of slightly warmer orange, red hues when it comes to the giant rock formations or the desert landscape. And when you think of the clear blue skies, you want to add a touch of teal or cyan into that just to create a little bit more pizzazz. So I'm going to show you how we can get there, and then I'm going to show you how we can take it to the next level. As you can see, I've got a very basic node tree over here going on, and we're going to dive into the first node, which is the CST. So if I just enable that, let me show you what's happening up here. We've got the DGID gamut and DGID log, and we're converting it over to DaVinci wide gamut and DaVinci intermediate. Now, if you're already lost, click off this video, go put yourself in a corner and tell yourself you've been a very naughty student. But if you're following, we're going to create another CST, and once I enable this, you'll see a big transformation. So what we're doing here is taking DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, and we're converting it over into a Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4 space. So let's close that down. So from here, when we're analyzing this shot, I feel like the exposure is a little bit too bright, and I want to control the contrast and inject a little bit more saturation into it. But as you can see on this node tree, I don't really have a designated white balanced node this time. I've got what you refer to as a look node. So let's start breaking this down. Let me enable the exposure, and you can see that I've just reduced it a tiny bit just to kind of soften the highlights, create a softer roll off, and it's also creating a little bit more depth into the sky and the shadows as well. It kind of sharpens up the entire image as well. From there, we're going to add some saturation, and the way I've gone ahead about handling the saturation is, as always, HSV node, and we're only working on the saturation channel. Good. And you can see I've injected about 1.46 in my value, so just under 1.5, round about the 1.4 mark. Depending on what your shot needs, be particular with ingesting your level of saturation. You don't want to go too far. We still want to be able to create a look that is digestible. And then from that point, you'll notice everything still feels a little bit flat. And the way that we start developing a little bit more depth in the early stages, the primaries, guys, is through contrast. So let me go ahead and enable that contrast node. And you can see we've started to deepen the shadows. Even the colors in the sky feel a little bit more rich. And if you've gone ahead and watched some of my previous videos, you'll know that when you start to inject contrast into your shot, a natural result of that is to also add to the saturation. So now it's working hand in hand. And the way that I've gone about adding contrast into this is just by using the slider. I'm not using the actual custom curve yet, but we're going to get to that. So I'm adding a little bit of saturation into this, maybe around about 1.12, 1.13, and I'm taking the pivot, and the further I go to the right, the more we're closing down the image, because I want to protect the amount of exposure that I've currently got it set to within my exposure node. And just reverting back to the exposure for a second, the way that I'm handling this, I'm making finite adjustments within my HDR wheels. So I'm bringing down the global exposure by about a quarter stop. And I'm handling the light, which deals with the nuances of highlights, by raising the number up to about 0.15, just to give it a little bit more of a boost. And I'm also lifting up the shadows by about a quarter stop, and then pulling back the darkest parts of the image by about a quarter stop, just so we can deepen the shadows a tiny bit. So now when I start developing a look, and you can see what happens here, just kind of reduces the amount of magenta in there, adds a little bit more of a cyan tone into the sky. We're cleaning up the more desert landscape on the ground to feel a little bit more yellow, orange. This will give you a very basic starting point, but it all works in unison. And the important thing is, I don't really want to be staying on this shot too long because I want to show you how to take it to the next level. But when we do go on to our look development and I pop over into this little puss, you can see I'm starting to affect parameters. I'm shifting where the blues live, I'm shifting where the yellows live, just so we can warm up the environment. I'm also twisting the red just so it doesn't fall within the magenta spectrum too much. And then when we go over into our saturation, you can see that I'm giving it a push. I wanted to bring out the colors in the sky, I wanted to bring out the colors in the foreground. So we're playing a little bit of a balancing game within our hue versus section. Even the luminance, I wanted to lift up the luminance that was contained within the sky, but I also want to create a little bit more depth in this foreground area here as well. So then moving forward, highlights and shadows. If I just enable this, you can see I'm grabbing the brightest regions of this entire shot, which falls within the ground, falls within the very spectral highlights of the sky, and I'm just pulling it back a tiny bit. I'm using my primary wheels and I'm just taking the highlights and I'm reducing it by about 20%, just so that roll off feels a little bit softer. And then with the shadows, you can see that it's deepening the darkest parts of this image, and again, that's all within the log wheels. I'm only dropping that by about -2. And that's how you're going to have a very basic entry point into a teal and orange look. If we go on to our second version, you can see we're starting to create a little bit more drama, and the difference between this look and the one before is very simple. We're creating a little bit more intricate work, specifically with the use of masks, just to create a little bit more depth and focus, which is also helping to enhance saturation in certain areas, and it's creating layers. And then within our look development node, you can also see that within our shadows, I've started to shift the hue of the shadows closer to the blue hue, which is giving it a little bit more of a cinematic feel. So now this is starting to feel like it could live within something like a Ford commercial. And I'm just going to pull back the blues a touch just so it's not overpowering. And you can see when we start looking at our saturation areas, we're starting to inject a little bit more color and life into these parts. But the major aspects here are the look development and the windows, just to draw a little bit more focus. Now, how do we take this to another level? This still feels very rudimentary, so if we want to start adding a little bit more character into this, how do we take it to the next level? So I've created another version, and this is where it starts to get tricky. Boom. Now this is a very stark contrast in comparison to what you just saw to where it lives now. And the major things that are happening here are a little bit more intricate contrast work, and we've got a little bit more of a manipulated look development node, and we're starting to create a little bit more separation within the color palette, specifically within the sky and the foreground, and then using our masks to our advantage as well. So what's happening? Let's break this down. If I go over into my contrast, you can see that I've created anchor points to be able to manipulate the type of contrast coming through in this image, and you can see the amount of depth that that adds into the image in comparison to this is unrivaled. When you start to become a little bit more particular, your creative choices reflect your vision even closer. I've created a softer S-curve within the contrast, and then I've taken the ratio and I've pulled back some of the contrast in this just to soften up those shadows. So I'll show you what happens if I just punch in and bring it to around about here. Just keep your eyes on the shadows. If I start to pull this back, you can see that it softens everything. It's also raising up the balance of where the exposure lives when you reduce the contrast. This is where you can start to use your pivot, and you can close it down just to retain the parameters that you set for your exposure initially. Now I'm just going to undo that just because I actually like where my contrast is. The look development is where things start to get interesting. If I just disable this, you can see that it's still very close to where we were here, but when I enable this, you can see there's a lot more happening. It's injecting a lot more warmth into the shot, and one of the key reasons of how we're doing that is because I'm taking the gain and I'm shifting it over into that warmer side of this color wheel to enhance the golden hour tone but still retain the blues in the sky, and I'm just offsetting that within my gamma by pulling it in the opposite direction just so it doesn't become overwhelming. And if I just disable the gamma, you can see that the color we're injecting through our gain becomes very overpowering to our image, so we have to then take our gain and just start coming in the opposite direction just to start cleaning it up a tiny bit. But I'm just going to reset that because I liked where my settings were at before this. Have a play around, see what works well for your situation and your environment. In terms of look developments, this is how I'm achieving that warmer, much more golden hour setting, kind of reminiscent of The Lion King, for example. Now, I want to show you something which is a conscious choice of mine. When I disable this node, you can see there's not much saturation or much life coming through the sky. So what I've gone ahead and done is created a little gradient mask, as you can see here. And what I'll do is I'll just highlight this so you can see what's happening. And I'm separating the sky from the foreground and then taking the offset to inject a little bit more color into it. So you can see it brings back that life we were just losing in the sky and creates a little bit of separation, which feels a little bit more cinematic as well. And then that paired with our window just brings back a little bit more focus into this area opposed to just having a wider field of view. And that's how you take this teal and orange variant and shift it into the next level of teal and orange to create a little bit more of a cinematic filmic version without using LUTs. Now if I head over to the next shot, you can see the way that this translates over onto this is how we say very yummy. And again, I've got different versions of this. This is what I would class as the more rudimentary version. This is slightly elevated, and then this just brings it all together and adds that filmic tonality into the shot, into the scene. We've got a lot of separation with the sky in the foreground. The tricky element of this is to maintain his skin because of how close it lives on the spectrum to the rocks. So if I disable this, you'll notice how hot his skin actually looks. Let me just punch in Emiliano Vargas. You can see even in his cheeks, his thighs. That one is big boss talking cheeks, talking thighs. Not good. It just feels too hot. And when I enable this, we're just cleaning some of that up. And it's also having a positive effect on the rocks as well. So here's a wider version. We're just taking out some of the heat in that red channel and controlling it to feel a little bit more like it's a conscious decision. And when I play that back, it just looks much nicer. It blends really well together. So if we see what the next shot's doing, now this is one of my favorite shots from the entire campaign that these boys at Boohoo Man filmed with Emiliano. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at the dust. Look at the sand dust just flying past him, man. And I'm just going to stop over here on our hero shot and I'm just going to go through this one by one. If we take it through the stage of adding our CSTs and converting it over into a Rec 709, we've got the DNA of how this look should be. And what you need to be able to do is learn how to create separation. And to reiterate, we do that through our primaries by manipulating the exposure just to kind of get it into the realm that we want, adding a bit of contrast into that, which will then expand our scope and start to expand that dynamic range so we can then begin to manipulate colors. If we then add some saturation into this, we're giving ourselves a little bit more room to play with. But again, notice how these primaries are affecting our subject and the environment around him. Even the sky feels a little bit thick. Even the tonalities on his skin feel quite thick. So we have to be able to control that, right? So then when we start doing our look development, you can see it in the beginning, it doesn't feel very good. It doesn't feel very professional, which is where our look development then slots in. And you can see that we're tweaking that greenish yellow hue to live more within the magenta and red realm, but I'm not necessarily a massive fan of that, so we have to learn to be able to clean that up. Like, I enjoy what it's doing to the rock formations and the sky, but I'm not necessarily too keen on what's happening here with his skin. It's just feeling a little bit lifeless, too dark. Like, Emiliano Vargas doesn't look like this. When we create our layer mixer for our highs and shadows, we can start cleaning up some of the color tints, but the skin node is where most of the magic happens. He is falling a little bit too dark within this. So what's another thing that we can do? If I go ahead and create a separate node, I'm just going to punch out of this. I'm going to create a little window. I'm just going to bring it over Emiliano and I'm just going to give it a little bit of direction from where I believe the light source is coming from, around about here. So I'm just going to rotate that just to live above him. And I'm going to start adding some softness into this, maybe around about 20%. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to track that. And you can see that it does a pretty good job in tracking milli, but I don't necessarily really want it to affect the rocks as it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over from clip to frame, and then that allows me to protect all of the data tracking that's just happened, but be able to manipulate certain frames of where this track thinks it should be. So then if we go to the very start, and I just bring this across a little bit, and I'm just going to start to reduce that, and now we've got a better track. And what I'm going to do, because his skin lives within the gamma section of our wheels, I'm just going to lift that up a tiny bit. You can already see it's already giving him a bit of a boost and more life, and he looks closer to how his skin does in person. So then when I just play that back, that feels way nicer. And this can go hand in hand with the skin node, where say if I just want to pull back the amount of lift we're giving him within the gamma, I can then go ahead into the skin node that we created and just take this shadows wheel and lift it up by maybe like 4%, 5%, just what feels nice. So we're taking the heat out, but we're starting to lift up the luminance value of his skin. Just punch into this. Now that we've got this first window, I can go ahead and click Alt-P just to create a parallel node, and I can start creating more windows within this section that just blend in very well with each other. So again, I'm gonna have to click on the node first. So if you're over here, enable. If you're over here, you're not gonna be able to activate your windows, so you have to click on the node itself, and I'm gonna create a circle. I'm just gonna punch out. I'm gonna make sure it covers this space. Almost feels like a little bit more of a letterbox vignette, and I'm gonna add some softness into that, and I'm just gonna invert it, making sure that this node is highlighted. I'm gonna hit Alt or Option O, and that's going to create an outside node, and you can see this is the coverage that we've just created, and in the outside node we're affecting everything inside of that. So starting off here within this node, we're going to go into our custom curve, and we're just going to enable editable splines, and I'm just going to take that bottom point, I'm just going to give it a slight raise, and this other anchor point is created, I'm just going to bring that down very gently, and then again I'm just going to do the same but on the opposite end. I'm just going to start extending this and giving it a slight raise, but I don't want the highlights to increase by too much, so I'm just going to bring the top end down a little bit more. And if I just enable and disable this, you can see it's just drawing that focus into this, and it's adding a little bit more drama. However, it's also increasing the amount of saturation coming through. So I'm just going to go back into that saturation node and just pull it back a tiny bit, just so it's not as thick or as heavy. And I can even go into our look development, and I can take some of the points that we've created here. As you can see, I've already started to pull back some of the saturation from the environment, but you can go ahead and do a little bit more just so it blends nicer. And then when I play that back, boom, look at that. If you didn't know that this was filmed on a drone, you'd think that it was on a Steadicam and it was just someone pulling it across based on the actual movement. Knowing that this is DJI footage and it's from a drone, which can be notoriously difficult to deal with, this feels very cinematic. It feels really nice to look at, and it feels like it could blend in with a larger camera like a FX3 for example, maybe even the Lumix S5X Mark II, maybe even the Fuji X-H2S. I'm trying to say my music can fit with all of them prosumer cameras, mine. And one thing you can go ahead and do is enable the noise reduction, just to clear up the noise that we were picking up in the sky. So if I just punch into this, not his bogies, over here into the sky, you can see before we're picking up the specks and it feels very clunky, and when you start to enable the noise reduction, just does enough to clean everything up without creating artifacts. So then when you want to go ahead, when you want to add some film grain to this, just search for it in your effects tab, drag and drop. I'm a fan of more finer grain. I don't really like larger grain, so what I am gonna do is probably keep it out around about 16mm 500T, and because you're able to pick this up even on his shirt, I'm just gonna focus on what's happening here in the sky. I'm gonna take that grain size and I'm just gonna bring it down a tiny bit. I'm also gonna pull back some of the grain strength, just because I don't want it to be too strong, but just enough to give it that filmic vibe, even just playing around with the texture a tiny bit. And then if we open up advanced controls, there's nothing really that I want to affect here, so I can close that down. I'm just going into the global blend. I do want it to come through, so I'm not really going to add any blend into this. But now when I just take a look at the grain itself, making it slightly bit stronger, and then disable that, reset this, it feels very filmic. And to say that this is drone footage does feel like it comes from a slightly more professional camera. Taking a look at how we've controlled the skin, even the environment around him, everything feels very filmic. But if you notice, we're also protecting the white values and the black values. So this will often go hand in hand with things that are related more to fashion, beauty, campaigns. And these are the tweaks that we need to know how to make when we're creating something that feels very vivid, but at the same time retains naturalistic qualities. And honestly guys, it's as simple as that. So when we go back and revisit some of the other shots that we were working on before, you can see just making controlled decisions within our look development can enhance the vibe so far beyond just that rudimentary basic level, and take it from feeling intermediate to feeling a little bit more professional when we are creating more profound looks like this. And the beautiful thing is guys, we've done this all within the space of 15 nodes. So we started off with our CSTs, we then went ahead, started working on our exposure, our look, saturation, contrast, then doing our look development adjustments, then taking our highlights and our shadows, and then working on the skin just so it feels a little bit more natural and balanced, then giving it a slight lift and creating windows around this to bring our focus back in. And it was as simple as that. Now that I'm back, I need you to give me some love. I'm sorry I left you. I didn't mean it. I did mean it because I had to go do some work, but I'm glad that I'm back. And guys, this week I will be randomly selecting 3 winners from my previous video, the clean white look. So if you haven't dropped a comment on that or subbed, go back to that video, watch it, drop a comment, because I will be selecting 3 random winners for the giveaway. So if you want a chance to win that giveaway, all you gotta do is go give it a like, comment, sub to the channel, and then when I stick this in the random generator, your name could be pulled up and you could be one of the winners of the giveaway. So if you like this one, you know what you need to do. Hit that like button, hit that comment button, hit that sub button, fiddle with your belly button. Yeah, intrusive thoughts. By now you should know I'm not sorry. But if you enjoyed this one, you know how we end it each and every time. Alright, cool. Chef Odd. Peace.